Hello and welcome to another Interaction Series professional learning video as part of our Breakthrough Curriculum Recipe Card Implementation Support. My name is James Busey and it is my pleasure to be your host for today's session. Focus of today is part of the reading curriculum and a particular focus on the role of fluency and the importance of fluency. We're going to explore the concept of fluency and seek to answer the following four questions. What do we mean by fluency? Why is it important? How do we assess it? And ultimately, how do we improve it for our learners? As I hope you're becoming familiar with now, the structure of these sessions follows a similar routine. So there's input. There will be some questions for you to consider. Your in-school facilitator will pause the video at set points and host that discussion. There's always a follow-up activity, and then by bringing all those things together, it is hoped that you come to some new form of understanding, a deeper form of understanding which can influence and change your practice. And as ever, just a reminder that everything you need to engage with all parts of the Breakthrough curriculum can be found on the SBC Way Launchpad. QR code takes you directly to it. Don't forget that this is primarily linked to Glow Schoolhouse. So resources, if you ever come up against a blocker, it's because you need to be logged into Glow to access these things, because the vast majority of our staff and schools use curriculum machines which automatically connect into Glow as opposed to corporate machines. Anyway, Launchpad, and then for reading, we're looking for Breakthrough Curriculum and we're looking for the reading framework. Okay, let's crack on and think about fluency. But before we do, another reminder, as we've done with a lot of our literacy focused sessions, whilst we're talking about fluency, which is one part of reading, it is very difficult to completely separate reading, writing, listening and talking and all its component parts and make them completely separate, because ultimately what we're looking to support our children and young people to be is literate, and to be literate means to be able to listen and talk and read and write competently, and they're so interlinked. So what we really want is a holistic approach to literacy, and supporting fluency is one way of being holistic in our approach. But you'll also see on the slide here that we've got that oracy framework, which we are really advocating and using to build our listening and talking approach, because there are certain elements of particularly speaking, but then also for listening, that we really do need to put a very fine focus on. And reading audibly out loud with fluency is one way that we can support an oracy skill. So please bear that in mind as we go through this session on fluency. It's also important to remember that fluency is just one bit of reading. Now, our reading breakthrough curriculum is built on a wealth of literature. So we've got the 5 pillars from the National Reading Panel that was from America back in 2000. We've got Scarborough's reading rope in there. We've got the simple view of reading. All of these things have then led to what we're calling our pillars and foundations. And you can see that fluency is just one of those that sit on, as I just mentioned, oracy, writing, that sit on the importance of just having a knowledge-rich, and knowledge as in kind of awareness of the world, rich understanding and experiences, not facts and figures, but a knowledge-rich experience and curriculum. And recognizing that text complexity is a really, really important part of improving reading outcomes. So fluency is one of 5 things, and we're going to mention all of these 5 today when looking specifically at fluency. So I guess the first question we want to explore and answer is, what is fluency? Now, there's a lot of research, literature on the subject, but ultimately it's been distilled down to these three components. This visual actually comes from the Education Endowment Fund report on reading and supporting reading. And you can see here that when we talk about fluency, we're looking for three things. Fluency is about accuracy, which is reading words correctly. It's about automaticity, which is reading words automatically. And it's about prosody, which is reading with appropriate stress and intonation. That is ultimately reading as if you were speaking. So it's these three parts that make up fluency: accuracy, automaticity, and prosody. And we need to be mindful of all three parts when trying to support our learners to become more fluent. Now, as we've said a lot when we're talking about reading, and the simple view of reading says that there are two components to being a capable reader, a competent reader. One of them is the decoding and one of them is comprehension. And fluency is part and parcel of enabling those two things to come together. So accuracy, when you're talking about reading words correctly, there needs to be decoding going on. Automaticity is as we start to build up our sight word vocabulary bank. And then the prosody is, and when we bring those two things together and we can start to do those things automatically, we can add in that element of intonation and appropriate stress. Why is it so important? Well, the researchers, the clever people, say that fluency is actually the bridge between decoding and comprehension. It is really, really difficult to comprehend a text if you can't read it fluently. If you are stammering and stuttering over every second word, if you don't actually know what a lot of the words mean, that is also a real challenge to comprehension. So fluency is being able to decode. It's about recognizing and knowing those words, bring it all together. You can start to extract meaning from something. So it's so important to not only understand what it is, why it's important, but what we can do to support our learners. But as is the case with all things to do with learning, ultimately, but with literature and literacy particularly, it's complex. So before we jump into how do we fix fluency, there's a few things that we need to be really mindful of that can impede fluency. Because just because a child reads slowly or stutters doesn't automatically mean that they can't quickly remedy that. There might be some other things underlying it, and it's those other things that we need to be aware of. Really, really interesting work by Linnea Airy, who proposed a model that said that reading development takes place over 4 stages. They're flexible, children move through them at different levels, but ultimately there are 4 levels to developing a fluent and competent access to to decoding. So the first of these 4 stages is called the pre-alphabetic phase. And this is where beginning or beginner readers, they start to read by seeing symbols, by seeing images. And I think the McDonald's one uses a good example. If a new reader sees the M and the word underneath it, they will say, oh, look, we're at McDonald's, or that says McDonald's. They've associated meaning with a symbol. That is pre-alphabetic. There's no recognition of letter or sound correspondence, but they are associating meaning. Then you move on to the partial alphabetic, and this is where learners have an initial grasp of some letters and some phonemes, but they don't use them in their entirety to decode a word. So they might recognize s and n and see a picture and go, that word says spoon. They haven't read it in its entirety, but they do know some of the letters, some of the graphemes to be able to make a good guess and get it right. So that's partial alphabetic. Then you move on to full alphabetic. And at this point, our learners have a good grasp of the alphabetic code. They understand the first initial 44 phonemes, and they've started to explore the complex code with all the different variations, the different graphemes that can be used to make those 44 sounds. And they can start to, and do quite capably, sound out and read individual words. You have here clock, and it's clock. Read a word, done. And that starts to become more and more, they're not having to sound out and break down every word all the time, but they're still using that alphabetic code. And then you move on to the final phase, which is a consolidated alphabetic phase. Easy for you to say. Consolidated alphabetic phase. That is where the learner has a solid grasp, or an almost solid grasp, of the alphabetic code and its different graphemes. But they've also started to recognize that words are made up of component parts. So this is where the idea of morphemes. So unreachable. They can break a word down. They don't need to necessarily decode each separate section, but they're able to break a big word into its component parts. Unreachable. Unreachable. Consolidated alphabetic phase. And it's important for us as teachers to know what those phases are and where our learners sit on that journey. Because when we're thinking about fluency, there's absolutely no point in trying to encourage a learner to be fluent readers if they're pre or certainly partial alphabetic. They're still decoding at a granular level. They're not able to start being fluent yet. But as that full alphabetic phase, where they are able to read an increasing number of words with a good grasp of their decoding skills, and absolutely when they're being in that consolidated alphabetic phase, that's when fluency starts to come into play. And that is how we then start to move into comprehension, because they're able to read words at an individual level, they'll be able to apply meaning to those words, and they were able to extract meaning from all the phrases and sentences that they're reading. So this is an important thing to remember, that fluency will be impeded if a child or a learner isn't at the right stage of that phonics and alphabetic awareness journey. Another thing to think about here, and this is often a contentious issue, but it's worthy to just remember. Fluency is developed as we automatically recognize words. Now, there is a difference between automatically recognizing words and learning words by sight. The strongest advocates around this now are saying there is a difference between building a sight word vocabulary, which is what we do. That is what happens through a process called orthographic mapping. So that is when you start to take all the different phonemes and graphemes and you start to build a really strong memory in your long-term memory, a bank of all these and what they mean. Building a sight word vocabulary, that is what we do. Learning words by sight is not what we do, and is not what we shouldn't be advocating that. Okay, now there is a place for high frequency words. This is where it's a bit nuanced. High frequency words, which is different to sight words. We shouldn't be encouraging or promoting children to learn words by sight. It's not appropriate. It is also not the best way to learn. However, it is important that for some words which were deemed as high frequency words, that we introduce these to our learners at an appropriate phase, because there are certain words high frequency because they come up in a huge number of texts and a lot of places. It's helpful to know those words so that when you see them, you're not trying to struggle and it's not impacting your comprehension of a text. Often these words are they're words that, like the, or they're prepositions like of and from. They might be pronouns like there. They could be conjunctions that glue sentences together. It's also important to remember that many of these high frequency words, they're irregular in their phonetic pattern. So they often will use, say, was is a great example of a high frequency word. Was is written W-A-S, as. We don't say was, we say was. So there's an irregularity about it. It doesn't mean we can't decode it, because as we learn the whole complex code, we learn that can sometimes be the off sound. But for early readers and just getting them reading, it's appropriate for them to know, you know what, this word says was. We can decode it, we will decode it, but for now it's was. So that's a high frequency word. It's not a sight word. However, the more we read, the more we're introduced to the complex code, the more we use our skills of decoding, and the more we understand what words mean, we build a sight vocabulary. So that's why me as an adult, I'm not decoding all the time, because I've got so many words in my long-term memory that I now know. I have built a sight word vocabulary. But that is different to learning words by sight. I didn't learn all those words by memorizing them. I learnt them through reading and through using my decoding skills to build up that bank. Okay, so that's important. So to support fluency, we're looking at ways to build up that sight word vocabulary by exposure to words, using our decoding skills. And as we're going through, it's also making sure that the meanings of those words are made clear. And we spoke about that in our word level session. The importance of vocabulary and making sure that our learners, all learners, understand the meaning of words. And let's not assume that all learners do. All right. Last thing before I pause and ask you to think a little bit. Another thing to be mindful of here is this thing called perceptual span. So as we read, we, as adults, as efficient readers, we can see based on where we put our eyes. So perceptual scan is the idea of where your eyes are and how much of the word or the sentence you're reading. As adults or as competent readers, we look at a point on the page and we are able to look about 4 to 6 letters backwards and about 8 to 12 letters forwards in front. So we're constantly using our perceptual span to help us think about and interpret what's come before, what's coming next, and I draw information from that, and that helps me to read. As a new reader, or if a struggling reader, we have a very limited perceptual span. And so you can see from the graphic here that actually, when you're so focused, you're only really looking at it's like 1, 2, 3 letters before, maybe 1, 2 after. It's a very narrow bit. So to be able to draw meaning or information from what's around where I'm looking, it's much more difficult. Now, the way that we improve perceptual span is by improving decoding skills, by improving that automaticity, and we start to be able to become more fluent, and our perceptual span increases because we're not so reliant on being focused on what's immediately in front of us. So just another thing to be aware of. Why is a child struggling to read? Well, they're probably not going to be competent in their decoding. They may not have a great strong vocabulary bank and perceptual span. They may be needing to use so much energy to break down every little bit that they're not able to look wider than that particular part of the sentence. Okay. Question. And your in-school facilitator will pause this video at an appropriate time. What messages, what ideas have caught your attention so far today? Please share, think and discuss. And I'd also like you to think about in what ways are you already purposefully and explicitly supporting fluency development. And if you're not, then have a think about why. Okay, you can click play when you're ready. So we know what fluency is. We've got those 3 descriptors there. We know why it's important, but how do we assess it? Now, this was mentioned briefly in the introducing the reading curriculum, but we'll go into a little bit more detail here today. Before we talk about how to assess it, it's important to know what we're measuring. And fluency is measured by a unit of words per minute. So how many words can I read per minute? And that is, as an adult, as a competent reader, I am reading in excess of 200 words per minute, not far off my spoken word speed. So that's what, as adults who read a lot and have full access to our expanded sight word vocabulary and our decoding skills, that's the rate that we're reading at. With our children and young people, we're going to be thinking about these 3 measures that are on the screen in front of you. So for a learner to have adequate fluency, adequate means that they should be able to access the text and draw meaning from it, and that's what we want. So they should be able to comprehend what they're reading if they've got approximately 110 words per minute as their reading rate. Ideally, we're looking to get our primary school learners, particularly second level going through to kind of primary 6, primary 7, you're looking for 150 words per minute. But as long as we're at 110, that fluency will actually grow as an independent reader. Okay, where we need to really focus our time and attention and our energy is for those children and young people who are below 110 words per minute, and specifically and very importantly, those children and young people who are below 90 words per minute. Research and literature says very clearly that a child whose word per minute rate is below 90 is going to really struggle to glean meaning from a text and therefore really struggle to enjoy it. Because ultimately we enjoy something that we can read confidently and that we can get meaning from, whether that be a narrative or whether it be something of informative nature. So we need to think about and know what rate our learners are reading at. And then we can do something about it. So being mindful of those different rates and mindful that 110 is sufficient, but really when we start, unless we get to that 110 words per minute, we need to think about how we can improve it, and especially if it's below 90, how can we assess it? Well, there's two ways to do it. It's what I would say is the way to assess reading rate is not an exact science. There are some tools that you can use online, the kind of official test. There's a Diaballs, which is available from America. It's free to download. You can use those things, but they can be clunky to administer. In essence, what a fluency rate does is ask a child, a young person, to read a piece of unfamiliar text that is appropriate for their age and stage, a text that they should be able to read, and to see how many words they read in 1 minute. That's it. And you kind of take a measure of that. It's not an exact science because depending upon the text, some of the words in that text will be more familiar to them than another text, even if both texts are of the same book band level, for example. There may just be certain things about certain texts which are easier for a learner to grasp, to read, to understand. So that's what it's not an exact science. If you were to take a non-fiction text compared to a narrative text, there would be a difference. If you were to take a piece of poetry or a play script, there would be a difference. So not an exact science, but it is a very helpful measure to go with and to start with. Two ways to do it, both doing the same thing. Taking a piece of text, ask a student to read it for 1 minute, and you as the adult or an adult or a peer, there's no reason why it couldn't be a peer, couldn't be why you couldn't even have some primary 7s, primary 6s doing this as a measure, as a support. Be very interesting maths task as well. The data that you could get from that with some younger learners. The important thing is that it's for 1 minute. It's a text that is appropriate age and stage for them, and that the listener is just counting how many of those words they are able to read in the minute. That's a teacher-led or adult-led or person-led. There is a tech-led way. You can use, it's called Reading Coach. It is available through, at the moment, particularly easy to use through Microsoft OneNote. And the way that works is that you copy and paste a text into OneNote, and then you click on the Immersive Reader tool. And Immersive Reader tool then has the option for Reading Coach. All instructions for this, by the way, are in the Assessing Reading folder on the Launchpad, which takes you to the schoolhouse. So all the instructions for this, including some suggested texts. If you are not quite sure what text to use, now the first thing I would suggest is reading books in schools are designed and written to be age and stage appropriate. So you'll have a whole suite of text that would be appropriate for the learner. But Oxford OWL online, they do free ebooks, and a number of those have been selected and identified as appropriate for different ages and stages. And again, you'll find that a link to that within the assessment tool part of the Launchpad. So that's how we can assess fluency. And now we need to think about how do we improve fluency. So how do we improve fluency? Well, back in 2000, the National Reading Panel concluded that oral reading practice coupled with feedback and repetition was most valuable in developing fluency. So providing some kind of guidance in how to pass break-up or chunk sentences, where to pause when reading so the words are grouped appropriately, that's the kind of input and instruction that's beneficial. Oral reading instruction, this involves an adult, a teacher, modelling the fluent reading of a text first, and then pupils reading the same text aloud, but with feedback from the teacher. It's an opportunity to make the implicit explicit by expertly modelling fluency through appropriate use of pace, expression, punctuation, and phrasing, all important features of effective prosody, that third part of fluency. This, so that guided oral reading instruction, along with repeated reading, is really key. And research has shown that repeated reading up about 3 times, no more than that. The 3 seems to be optimal. Repeated reading involves pupils rereading a short text a set number of times, 3, until they reach a suitable level of fluency with that piece of text. It's a great way to develop accuracy and automaticity when encountering complex Tier 2 or sometimes even Tier 3 vocabulary that we spoke about in the previous video. In terms of what types of text to use when improving and supporting reading fluency, some teachers like to select special texts like poetry. Poetry naturally has a kind of a cadence to it, a rhythm and a rhyme. But don't forget, we're wanting to develop fluency across all texts. So actually what you want to do is provide a variety. And you're wanting to make sure that the material is relevant, that it's interesting, that students are actually going to learn and get something out of it as well. So always looking to use text from across the curriculum. In terms of the level of text when developing fluency, make it too easy. There needs to be some struggle, some productive struggle in this. So repeated oral reading activities, it's more productive to work with texts that are challenging, even sometimes at the frustration level, because it takes a bit more rereading and kids learn from this and they kind of make progress through those mistakes. In terms of how much rereading, I said there, you're looking kind of 3 times seems to be the most. You could do it more than that, but it doesn't seem to make much significant difference. So guided oral reading with a text, teacher modeling exactly how to read it, students then repeat that back. And then that repeated reading of the text. This is really done well in pairs where you're listening to each other and that pair can be giving feedback on how well that has gone. So let's remind ourselves of why this is important. It's important because fluency is the bridge between decoding and comprehension. You can't comprehend if you can't get meaning. You can't get meaning if you can't read fluently because you're spending so much time in the kind of the pit of decoding. So fluency helps us take the decoding the word level and turn it into meaning. Okay, so time for some conversation, some discussion. 3 questions for you, and your in-school facilitator. Click pause when you're ready to think about and discuss these 3 issues. First question then, if we were thinking about the phases of alphabetic learning, where are your learners on that journey from pre-alphabetic to partial alphabetic, full alphabetic, consolidated alphabetic? Think about where your learners are. And if they're sitting in those final 3 and 4th phases, that's where you can think about, okay, how fluent are they? So my second question then is, for those that are ready for it, sitting in those final 2 phases, how could you incorporate fluency assessment into the coming days and weeks so that you can be getting data information for how fluent my readers are? And the 4th one is, the third question then is, how might you try guided oral reading with your class? How can you introduce a text, model it yourself, have your students to repeat it, and then get them to reread that no more than 3 times in a pair, taking it in turns, giving feedback on how they did, and see the impact. Pause the video now for your conversations and then press play when you're ready. We're nearly there. It's time to think about follow-up. It's time to think about what next. And actually, these what next link directly to the questions that I've just asked you to think about. Identify, go away now and think about your learners out of your classes. For those that are, it's appropriate, who are those who are sitting at that phase 3, phase 4, full alphabetic, consolidated alphabetic? They're starting to read with some form of joined up, connected approach, and decide who they are, either because that's where they're at in their phase of learning or because they're struggling and you need to put some intervention in. Assess them. Use a text. You'll have plenty of texts available that are age and stage appropriate, and ask the child to read it for 1 minute and you count how many words. It's a rough science, it's not an exact science, but it works as a starting point. And then start teaching and start using that guided reading and introducing it into your week and that paired feedback to improve practice. So thank you for joining me for this session about fluency. It is often overlooked as a pillar of reading. It's really important that we get it right. So today we've explored fluency in its entirety, as much as we could in a concise way. In terms of what we mean by fluency, we're thinking about accuracy, automaticity, and prosody. And those are the 3 parts that we're aiming to develop. We know why it's important because it's a bridge between decoding and comprehension. But we know it's complex, so we've got to think about the phonological skill set, that decoding, those vocabulary, building up that vocabulary bank, both in terms of sight, knowing more words and having them in the long-term memory, and the vocabulary knowing what they mean. We've talked about how we can assess it, and we've spoken about how we can improve it. So now I guess it's over to you to act on it, to try it, to introduce it into your practice. And I'm confident you will see improvement, because that's what we want to help our children to become capable and competent readers. So thank you so much for your time today. Keep joining the Interaction series as we continue to explore the reading components in more detail. If you want to do some follow-up, please use the clpl@scottborders.gov.uk email address. And finally, before you go, we are continuing to learn. Feedback is what helps us get better. There's a QR code on your screen. It will take you to a quick form which asks you to very quickly rate this session in terms of how helpful it was, and then provide you a space with a comment on what you think was good about it, what worked well, and what would have made it even better. And you're just going to look for the session titled Fluency on the form. That's everything. Thank you so much for your time. Take good care, and I look forward to being involved and seeing you at some point in the near future. Thanks all.